and I'll give you instructions on how to do that a little bit later. Good. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome here to Queen's this afternoon Professor Joe Nugent. Joe is Professor of English, or Professor in the English Department in Boston College, and his interests lie at the confluence of Irish studies, Joyce studies, and digital humanities. He has has been involved in a number of technological projects exploiting Joyce's texts as windows into the social and cultural life of fin de siècle Dublin. He has a classroom laboratory approach, which has generated products such as the iPhone app, Joyce Ways, the ebook Digital Dubliners, and the Dubliners Bookshelf. His digital guide and his 3D immersion experience appeared in Making It Irish at the Macmillan Museum at Boston College in 2016, and also at Boston College Ireland in Dublin. And his articles have appeared in, amongst other publications, Victorian Studies, The Senses and Society, and Era Ireland. His devotion to Joyce is also reflected in Raiden the Wake, his Finnegan's Wake reading group, and in the Boston Joyce Forum conferences, which he runs annually. So it's a great pleasure to have Joe with us today. Joe is visiting us as part of our annual faculty exchange with Irish Studies at Boston College. This is a very important mutual exchange relationship that we have here between Queen's and BC, and Joe is representing the BC side of that exchange here this year. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Joe, who's going to talk to us today about pigs, priests and people, how the Irish smelled civilization.
Great. Thanks very much. Good afternoon, and thanks for having me here. Thanks to the various people involved in organising this talk today, particularly Peter here himself, and of course Cathy Devlin, and people who've made me welcome as a participant in this Irish Studies seminar. And it's especially a pleasure in its strengthening the long-term relationship between your institute here and our Irish Studies programme at Boston College. Indeed, your own Siofra Aiken of your history department is speaking to us at BC on Wednesday. And we look forward to welcoming, in response to my visit, your Cheryl Lowther, I think, this year's candidate from Queen's, who's going to give a similar talk to our programme. And it is actually a good time to be doing this, because this programme of ours at Boston College, and a little bit of advertising here, I suppose, some marketing, 40 years since its inception, is right now reasserting itself in the burgeoning field of Irish studies in the United States. And I'm kind of surprised even to find myself using that adjective about Irish studies, but it is true that the market is kind of hot. A series of major universities in the States have recently advertised rather desirable and powerful positions, and none more so than ourselves at Boston College. Only last year we saw eminent historian Guy Biner, formerly of Ben Gurion University, nominated as the Sullivan Chair of Irish Studies at BC, and now appointed as Director of our Irish Studies programme. And then just last week, you might have seen, some of you in the business, an advertisement for a full-time tenure track assistant professor position in Irish Studies with the very wide remit that we've just put up. We've also just advertised a series of funded summer visiting fellowships. All that information is online for anybody out there who might be interested in it, indeed, and I know there's going to be a great interest in those positions. So Irish Studies in the US, most certainly at Boston College, is vibrant. I'm more than a little embarrassed about the title of today's talk, with its easy alliteration and the cheap reference to that book about how the Irish saved civilization, and I'm not sure from whom, but of course we have to be thankful that they did. Today, I want to talk about how the Irish smelt civilization. And I'm doing so because that sense, one we all know so well, one of which we typically understand so little, has recently come to the fore. Sensory studies has finally found its place in academic and scientific discourse. The presentation will be essentially historical. It'll examine a series of changes in olfactory perception in Ireland in the 19th century and attempt to explain them. But my paltry evidence will begin with literature, for that's all I know. Also, perhaps that's as it should be. Roy Porter's admonishment some years ago to his fellow historians for their lack of research into the history of smells, "Today's history comes deodorized," he said, is surely no longer true. But it does remain the case that literature is the well from which we can best draw as we attempt to imagine the smells of the past. Writers of poetry and fiction have long known that the fullest, the most palpable, the most human of texts must attend to all the senses, and not least to that most neglected of them, smell. We all know that some nations smell more than others. and certainly more than our own. That's to state merely that national identity contains an olfactory component. The curious case of Ireland will already be known to readers of Jonathan Swift, George Bernard Shaw, or James Joyce, whose finely tuned noses found inspiration in the reek of humanity. And add Flann O'Brien to that list. In his wicked novel, On Bealbocht, written under the pseudonym Miles Nagopoline, published in 1941, translated into English as The Poor Mouth, Flann O'Brien confronts the reader with stench as a cultural, historical, even ideological phenomenon. The Poor Mouth is set in the fictional village of Corcadorca in the west of Ireland around the turn of the 20th century. Its narrator, Bonaparto Cunisa, shares a rotting the interior here, a rotting whitewashed home, he calls it, with his reputed mother there on the left, a silent, cross, big-breasted woman, and a cantankerous old man of uncertain origin, the old grey fellow you see there on the right-hand side. The child's mother, we're told, spends her day endlessly sweeping animal droppings out of the door and boiling housefuls of potatoes for a third inhabitant, Ambrose, the pig that shares their truly Gaelic and certainly truly squalid hovel. When Ambrose was little, Bonaparte recalls, he had a little smell, but now grown too enormous to exit the front door, he gives off great plumes of what his protector, the old grey fella here, calls pig steam. So awful was the stench that passers-by neither stopped, we're told, nor even walked when in the vicinity of our house, but raced, says Bonaparte, past the door. Neighbours, too, were subjected to Ambrose's characteristic scent. Many fled. They cleared out and went to America, telling people that Ireland was a fine country, but that the air was too strong there. Smells, O'Brien and the other great Irish modernists understood, can make us laugh. Yet no smell is intrinsically funny. Odours have affective power because they are suffused with social meaning, and uncovering that meaning provides new ways to explore how the world is and was. For smells change. Rather, smells over time take on new resonances. They elicit varying emotional responses from us, reactions that can, in turn, shape the way we understand and frame our world. Sensory perception, that is, has a role in the construction of ideological frameworks. Today, I'm going to argue that the symbolic plane that Flann O'Brien chose for his preposterous novel of social satire, sad social satire, captures a moment of anxious transition in the modernisation of Irish domestic life. The pig in the parlour, badge of all that Ireland was, and the woman's sweeping brush, emblem of what it might be, here contend over the intimate space of the family home. And not just any Irish home, but the whitewashed, thatched cottage, later elevated into a national symbol of an independent, natural, morally upright and spiritual way of life, it's been called. The kitchen conflict of Corcadorca enacts two interrelated struggles taking place, I'm going to say, around the time of the Irish Revival. The greater was an ideological battle between the forces of tradition and modernity. The lesser, a tussle for dominion over domestic space, cast men against women. And both, I want to suggest, were fought to a degree not often acknowledged over that most elusive and memory-laden sense, the sense of smell. This paper argues that modern registers of sensory perception were introduced and disseminated by a rising Irish middle class for whom the stench of their peasantry had become a shameful marker of national backwardness. Recoiling from the odour of primitiveness that also clung to them, they demanded that the rural poor cast off practices of animal husbandry and personal hygiene, now to be understood as disgusting. Clergymen were in the van, introducing new notions of personal hygiene and raising the bar of intolerance to traditional odours. The smells of everyday life, as a result, took on new redolence as the home became a stage, as critics such as Claire Wills and Joanna Burke have shown, for the enactment of an unequal contest between a pre-bourgeois culture and an emergent ideology of modern domesticity. The effect of this phenomenological transformation was to introduce to a recalcitrant peasantry an olfactory register more akin to European sensibilities, and to ease them one step further into modern subjectivity, a reordering that, though it encountered resistance, was completed and even sanctified by the great civilizing force in rural Ireland, the Roman Catholic Church. A similar alteration in olfactory sensitivity had occurred in France a century before, when something changed, Alain Corbin has shown, in the way smells were perceived and analysed. While this olfactory revolution, as the French historian termed it, maps imperfectly onto the peculiarly Catholic Irish experience, clear parallels between the two offer an outline of the olfactory matrix from which this talk emerges. Above all, both experiences, governed by what Norbert Ellis calls the civilizing process, were articulated as a clash between modernity and tradition. The structural shifts that propelled the French transformation were replicated, I'm arguing, in Ireland. The spread of an originally urban middle-class sensibility, the codification of a new ideology of domesticity, the dissemination of hygienic discourses from a centralized machinery of state. The cognitive and emotional channels through which this transformation was brought about were also duplicated. In A, odour's deployment as a differentiator of class and an instrument for social discrimination. B, as the heightened awareness of hygiene and the privatization of excrement. C, in the production of disgust at emblematic points of putrefaction and the consequent arousal of shame. Finally, and very particularly in both cases, there was the perplexing defiance of a peasantry rejecting advances designed patently for its betterment. How strong was the air of Ireland in 19th century literature? Strong enough, according to critic James Newcomer, for whisky, decay, rot, guttering candles, tobacco, damp, horse dung, and dust are what lingered in his olfactory imagination after reading the novel with which the century began, Marie Edgeworth's big house novel, Castle Rackrent. Nearly 100 years later, it was the decaying cabin that stank. You want to know, asked George Moore, what Ireland is like? The country exhales, he answered, the damp, flaccid, evil smell of poverty. It hangs about every cabin. It rises out of the chimney with the smoke of the peat. It broods upon the dung heap and creeps along the deep black bog holes, the smell of something sick to death of poverty. In the years between Edgeworth's novel and Moore's diatribe, Ireland reeked from the pages of English representation, for there was, asserts Perry Curtis, scarcely a description of Ireland without its set passage on the dirt, misery, and primitiveness of the Irish cabin or rural dwelling. To English travellers, that hovel became emblematic of an almost troglodytic people's inability to emerge into the light of modern living. Samuel Carter Hall, an English but an Irish-born journalist, was horrified by its wretchedness, a growth of diseased vegetation, mud walls, the pig goes in and out as he pleases, while by the entrance a cesspool of stagnant water oozed from the dung heap. Blurring, in the words of Vina Ferris, the distinction between earth and habitation, these hovels breached the conceptual walls that Victorians had constructed to keep nature outside of the family home and to protect the precious domesticity within. Affronts to upright English manliness, they were physical expressions of the contorted Irish character, monuments sniffed punch in mid-century to national idleness, the personification, Charles Dickens thought, of misery. Happiness, he wrote, with cheap sarcasm, dwelleth in a roofless cabin, with potatoes thrice a week, buttermilk at Sunday, a pig in the parlour, and a fever in the dung heap. So frequently invoked was the dung heap, that the cesspool, the green sink of liquid pig's excrement in which it swam, became the very figure of the wretched island. When Thomas Carlyle returned to Scotland in 1849, he sighed with relief, as if he were entering into spring water out of dunghill puddles. And emanating from those puddles was what was to become the emblematic smell of Ireland, the whiff of pig manure. In the literature of many, and in the noses of some, that stench dominated what we might term, after geographer J. Douglas Porteous, the smellscape of the Irish countryside. The interior of the Irish cabin held an almost voyeuristic fascination for wandering gentry. George Moore, exploring the recesses of one such, found a dark place from which exudes a stink, a stink which the intimates describe as a warm smell. There, a large pig covered with lice feeds out of a trough placed in the middle of the floor, and the beast from time to time approaches and sniffs at the child sleeping in a cot by the fireside. It's clear from the 19th century paintings and prints assembled some time ago by Claude Kinmouth in her Irish Rural Interiors and in Art, that the pig, more observed in the parlour, was no mere slander, but of course everyday reality. Remarkably, perhaps, the pig in these illustrations is no intruder. Indeed, the animal is evidently a welcome guest in the domestic space. Here, sharing a dish of potatoes, there, gambolling about the hearth. In one touching cameo, an infant snuggles contentedly in the warm embrace of a snoozing elderly sow. The pig invokes from the family, it seems, none of the disgust that so unsettled their English visitors, or those Irish grandees who, like Moore, now recoiled from the peasantry with a similar distaste. Lady Morgan observed as much in a similar hovel. Sitting down to a plate of sour milk and potatoes, she noted a cow slumbering most amicably, with a large pig at no great distance from me. Far from distressed with their rank habitation, the family surrounding the playwright were quite content with the comforts, she says, of their snug quarters. The Irishman's ease with his pig was at odds, however, with new notions of hygiene already prevailing in England, to which in the latter half of the 19th century, the impoverished Irish increasingly fled. But the smell of the pig clung to the Irishman's person and increasingly came to define his identity. To the little Irelands of mid-century Liverpool, London, and Glasgow, Friedrich Engels saw them come, bearing their native customs and the noxious odours that accompany them. Like pervasive smells, he says, these Irishmen insinuate themselves everywhere. Pollutants, infusing themselves into the body politic, they festered in slums too repellent for all but the intrepid. Whenever, he says, a district is distinguished for a special filth and a special ruinousness, the explorer, as he called it, the explorer may safely count upon meeting chiefly Celtic faces. Obtuse, unassimilable, and indifferent apparently to his own stench, the Milesian, he says, continues as he did at home. He deposits all garbage and filth before his house door and accumulates pools and dirt heaps, which, he says, now invoking, of course, the invisible spirit of malaria and the understandings of miasma as the medical way in which diseases were supposedly passed. Poison, he says, poison the air. Pools and piles of effluent with their contaminating odours segue comfortably, of course, in Engels' mind into images of the pig and the Irishman. He remarks, the Irishman, he says, lets the pig sleep in the room with himself. Indeed more, for he loves his pig as the Arab his horse. He eats and sleeps with it. His children play with it, ride upon it, roll in the dirt with it. This brand of hostility, some popular journals discovered, could be commercially lucrative. What ensued was a plethora of hostile cartoons in English comic art, comprehensively catalogued by the same Perry Curtis in Apes and Angels. Curtis's genealogy of the proto-simian Irishman unearths Paddy's bestial ancestor in James Gilray's United Irishman engravings of the late 18th century. In the gaping mouth, upturned nose, exposed nostrils, and black marble eyes of these composite creatures, we find the visage of the pig. It is as if the Irish body, plainly human in form, must strain to contain a spectral swine struggling to emerge. 50 years later, the swinish Irish physiognomy continued, of course, to issue in the work of George Cruikshank, whose 1845 depictions of Irish brutes strongly suggest, as Curtis remarks their porcine ancestors. By mid-century, the relationship between Paddy and his pig was firmly and lastingly established. Deeply ingrained in the popular English imagination, the animal most closely related to filth and stench continued to metonymically define the Irishman, even to the recent past. There's now a substantial body of scholarship examining the semiotics of the pig, much of it investigating the animal's capacity to evoke in us distaste, even disgust. Peter Stallybrass and Alan White contend that this may be because we in the West, in our long shared history of concord and contention, have invested much in them. Symbolic repositories of the baseness we seek to expunge from ourselves, but simultaneously desire they mirror our worst parts. hapless receptacles of our psychosexual dramas, pigs throughout the ages seem to have borne the brunt of our rage, fear, affection, and desire for the low. Pigs were creatures of the threshold, almost, but not quite, members of the household. Indeed, not quite, for too much about the pig turns our stomach. For no apparent reason, the animal would regularly splash itself in mud, or with evident deliberation and apparent delight, urinate in its own dung and wallow in the mix. Avaricious and scandalous, it lurked by latrines in eager anticipation of a feast of human excrement. In contrast to the most of young, contrast to the young of most animals, the piglet was neither lovable nor helpless. Rather, it provided a particularly vicious instantiation for the Victorians of nature, bloody-minded in tooth, if not in claw, armed from birth with razor-sharp eye teeth. It competed from the moment of birth with its siblings. It lacerated them, turned on the runt, the most helpless. Even the mother, confounding all natural instincts, was known to consume her own litter. To be the object of that epithet pig, therefore, was to be subjected to a peculiarly demeaning insult. In a world before Porky Pig, Miss Piggy, or indeed Farmer Patrick Pig, and you unto me, but note the name, that is to say, before commodity capitalism recognized that anthropomorphism could be turned to commercial advantage, that the very identification with the pig that once threatened could now entice, that the pig could be, so to speak, defanged. The affinity with no domestic animal threatened, I can turn my page, threatened the imperative to civility, as did a putative relationship to the pig. In short, the term pig functioned as a resonant rhetorical device for marginalization and a catch-all term for those deserving rejection. By association, the pig's doppelganger, the Irishman, embodied all that was lazy, stupid, unrestrained, dirty, and putrescent. Distaste for the Irish poor, I have said, crystallized about the emblematic figures of pig and cesspool. These figures, however, are no more than the objective correlatives of the underlying emotion that I want to discuss, the emotion that travelers, authors, artists, and socialists organized about the tropes of health, primitivism, and above all, hygiene. Each of their reports returns us to the sense of smell. For the pig is not offensive to our sight, far less symbolically to our Western taste, and the cesspool need not be. Their affective impact, the sense that reacts to them, is olfaction. Suffused in the multifarious descriptions of the Irish hovel and the piggish Irishman, driving their distaste and emanating through the rhetoric they employ, is disgust at the unfragrant pig and its noxious byproducts. Disgust, Charles Darwin believed, is a universal emotion. His numerous worldwide correspondence saw it expressed and accompanied by a recognizable series of responses. The upper lip retracted, the lower lip protruded, an expiration such are the arms tight against the body as we shudder. Actions the same, Darwin observes, as those we employ when we perceive an offensive odor and wish to exclude or expel it. Disgust is universal emotion, but one that seems to be a cultural acquisition. And while it appears to have originated as food rejection, the most potent sensory attribute associated with that basic human emotion, experimental psychologists such as Jonathan Haidt and Paul Rozin explain, is odor, specifically the smell of decay and decomposition. They confirm Darwin's observation that this eruptive impulse is primarily induced by an assault on the sense of smell. In the facial expression he delineated, we see the urge, a primal urge, to recoil and to disgorge from the body the offensive substance we have encountered. Discussed in the 19th century view, emblematized by Darwin, is a rejection response, is the point. So what was to be done? How were the Irish to counteract a representation that exposed, as Stallybrass and White have shown, the dread trace of the abjected other? More immediately, how were they to escape the threat of ejection from the body politic, indeed from the civilized world, implied by the disgust that they patently engendered. The Irish middle classes at least knew how to respond. Determined not to be contaminated by association with pig and with peasant, they appealed directly to the governing classes of England. Prominent in this rhetorical counter-thrust was the romantic nationalist poet and songwriter Thomas Moore. Writing in the early decades of the 19th century, Moore set out to evince from his English drawing room audience not disgust, but sadness and guilt at an Ireland beautiful but wronged. In the Morning of Life, one of his poems is, yes, In the Morning of Life, I'm sorry, is the title, is typical of the balladry through which the poet, in a tumult of synesthesia, petitioned his readers' sensibilities. As the fragrance of Ireland is released by rain falling upon her flowers, Ireland, of course, gendered female, so the sorrowful love that the verse thematizes can, the poem asserts, be drawn out by tears. Ireland, far from malodorous, Moore asserts, in a surfeit of nationalist sentiment, is uniquely fragrant. Indeed, the poem distinguishes between his country and those foreign lands where, he says, though splendid the flowers, their sighs have no freshness, their odour no worth. In contrast, 'tis the cloud and the mist of our own isle of showers that call the rich spirit of fragrancy forth. But was Ireland's smellscape, in any but the most wishful sense, fragrant? The answer is, of course, speculative, but may in fact be yes. Outside of its unsewered cities and towns, we should imagine a 19th century countryside relatively pleasing to the nose. What filled the nostrils over much of the land were the soft fumes of turf fires, the burning peat to which George Moore refers above, and with which the Irish cooked and heated until recent decades. The potato crop, whose verdant leaves and delightful purple flower presented gentle fragrance, covered 2.5 million acres, 10% of the country's landmass. Rural Ireland's problem was not any generalised bad smell. A modern, a quintessentially Victorian and an eminently English one, it was basically cloacal. Approximately 3 pounds weight of excrement per day was emitted by each of Ireland's 1.4 million pigs, for whom a third of the land's potato crop was grown. The country's predominantly rural population of 8 million people probably produced per capita much the same. Pigs and humans consume and eliminate similar volumes. The dung heap by the door was the destination of both these products. A journey through the smellscape of Ireland, then, we might imagine rather pleasing, but interrupted by occasional wafts from the dung heaps befouling the entrance to some peasant hovels. This is hardly sufficient to account for the disgust engendered. That these highly localized instances of odours should so disproportionately offend the English nostril suggests that something else was going on. The disgust they had elicited, I suggest, was caused not so much by their presence as their positioning. Disgust, Mary Douglas contends, arises from the breaching of socially demarcated space. Things become pollutant by being out of place. Few infractions of spatial propriety were more sure to offend the Victorian middle classes than animal dung in the family home. Victorian ideology had designated that space an olfactory refuge to be carved off with great particularity from the stinks of public life. Its kitchen, bosom of domesticity, to be made fragrant by baking, defended by carbolic. The Englishman's disgust at the Irishman's dung heap was caused less by what entered his own nostrils than by the contaminant the sight symbolized. The problem lay less with the smell of the rancid cesspool than with the sensitivity of the refined observer. This trouble can be contextualized within the grander narratives of class and race and the expectations engendered by them. The English traveller, his or her mind perceiving the smells around them and registering those against the romanticized fragrances of their English childhood and against their presumptions about how Ireland would smell, may well have been less smitten by the country's odour than were Thomas Moore or Lady Morgan, whose perception was no less coloured, but in their cases, by a nationalism replete with preconceptions of how a romanticised Ireland should smell. By the same token, the heap of precious manure, while foul to the middle-class observer, may have been fragrant to the peasant farmer. Recall that what George Moore perceived as a stink, the inmates, as he called them, of the cottage described as a warm smell. Yet the same molecules were surging into both parties' nostrils, binding to the olfactory receptors of each. Only their perceptions were different. The extended historical moment this paper examines is one in which the English middle class and its Irish equivalent in anxious imitation had already developed a lower level of olfactory tolerance that did not yet prevail in rural Ireland. The untutored Irish peasant was not disgusted by the proximity of the pig and the cesspool because, I'm arguing, he had not yet learned that he should be. He was, however, about to be taught, and his indoctrination, brought about not at the hands of the distrusted colonizer, but of a rising Irish middle class scrambling to distance itself from the stench of its fellow Irishmen, was one of the more interesting transformations in the belated embourgeoisement of Ireland. That transformation in smell perception had occurred in France, I've said, as Elaine Corbin has detailed, more than a century earlier. Smells were, as never before, observed and noted. The thresholds of olfactory tolerance were abruptly lowered, so that odours once unremarkable were now noted and held suspect. A new awareness of the putrid spread through the social body. As the wealthy deodorized themselves, it was from the poor that stinks were now detected. Smell became a weapon in the social contest. The fierce resistance with which the endeavour was met is evidenced by the struggles of municipal officials and sanitary reformers in France. Theirs was a battle, Corbin reports, against dung, filth, and vitiated air. Their enemy, the peasants' loyalty, he says, to an ancien regime of sensory values. The Irish trajectory was no less contentious. The Parliamentary Act of 1854 targeting such nuisances as public cesspools and rotting animal corpses had, it seems, little effect. Public representatives remained uninterested in change, often actively hostile to the sanitation laws. Prosecutions were few, government officials complaining time and again about the wholesale disregard for their regulations. Yet the awareness of stink was increasing. By the 1880s, the middle-class child, Stephen Dedalus, James Joyce's alter ego, perhaps knew the characteristic odour of the unfragrant peasant at the back of the chapel at Sunday Mass, a smell of air and rain and turf and corduroy. Dublin newspapers like the Freeman's Journal grumbled that the dung heap remained an indispensable apparent adjunct to the Irish peasant life. But much of the peasantry remained unmoved. New registers of smell, they suspected, signalled new systems of control. The state was failing in its endeavour. What was to be done? Enter the priest. A king, wrote the French traveller Paul Dubois in 1908, in his kingdom. Trusted, revered, and feared, only he could tell the people that they stank. The priest's authority was powerful but recent. The Catholic hierarchy had instigated in mid-century a transformation in the Irish church so deep that scholars following Edmund Larkin now call it a devotional revolution. The project's determination to eradicate the disorderly remnants of semi-pagan beliefs and replace them with modern, authorized and disciplined practices applied as readily to the home as to the chapel. The operative term here is replace. For the Catholic hierarchy's civilizing mission constituted not just a radical overhaul, but a substitution of public and domestic practices in which purity of soul and cleanliness of the home became mutually authorizing public and private goods in the service of God, or at least the service of the institutional church. A realignment of olfactory references fell naturally within the remit of the devotional revolution, for instrumental in its astonishing success was an appeal to sensory perception. As the church dismantled or regulated traditional rites of piety, it opened up the senses, as if in compensation to novel experience. Ceremonies of grand theatricality were imported in which the whole world of the senses, Larkin tells us, was explored through music, singing, candles, vestments, and incense. Religious rituals, previously performed in the scattered homes of the faithful, were centralized in the new parish church's designated spaces marked off from the secular world by the uplifting odours of chrism, beeswax, and smouldering frankincense. As soon as you walk into a church, you know you are in a different space by the smell before you look at all. The odor of sanctity, one might say, displaced the stench of cow dung. A transformation of the everyday, the devotional revolution introduced a new sense of sin, a sensual puritanism, Larkin called it, that reconfigured what was decent and respectable, pleasurable and permissible. As with devotional practices, sensory inputs were redefined now as tolerable and illicit. Odors once thought acceptable, even agreeable, were now to be considered by reframing within the discourses of ill health, progress, and above all, morality, repugnant. As a result, the collective imagination of the Irish peasant was to be reshaped to induce in him or her revulsion to what they had hitherto found pleasing, and a desire for a new series of olfactory experiences. The Irish peasant's notion of disgust was to be reformulated in conformity with a modern, a European, most immediately, an English system of olfactory values. If reluctant, then he or she must first be made aware, then ashamed of their primitive conditions. In the reconfiguration of the Gaelo-Catholic conscience, dirt was now to be indexed under the increasingly capacious category of sin, and shame, ever present in the economy of Catholic social control, was to be mobilized to enforce the new order. And to the misery of poverty now was to be added the shame of sin. Many young men, many young clergymen had come to know shame very well. It was common that immediately following ordination, the newly ordained Irish priest be deployed in one of the great cities of England, serving alongside the genteel clergy of genteel Catholic clergy of England. He was exposed, like Canon Patrick Sheehan's eponymous priestly hero, Luc Delmage, to a bourgeois regime of sensory perception. Visiting the foul Irish ghettos, he recognized that his fellow exiles lived, indeed, much as Engels had reported. He himself was the butt of anti-Irish prejudice. Every man that lives amongst the English knows that they are always making jokes about Paddy and the pig, wrote another exile of the turn of the century, Michael Collins. The effect of these experiences, a contending melange of admiration and shame that induced an inevitable ressentiment, propelled the clergyman's zeal for change on his return to Ireland. Such a one was Father Joseph Guinan, in whose many popular novels we can trace that shifting olfactory perceptions that underlay the transformation in Irish rural life. When Father Devoy of his The Island Parish novel returns to the land he had once thought fragrant, all seems changed. As if through new eyes, he sees the marks of his people's degradation, their slovenly, slatternly ways, their dirty houses, dirty clothes, dirty children. The taunt, dirty Irish, had been thrown time and again at him in England. Now he has to concede there was some foundation for the Galling jibe. He recalls the epithets with an anger intensified by shame. Like his creator, Father Guinan, on his own return from Liverpool in 1900, the fictional priest determines to transform his parishioners. He will educate them into cultivating not only habits of tidiness and orderliness, but a higher standard of taste. Sanitas sanitatis, he tells us, will be his battle cry. He will institute a crusade against dirt and unsanitary conditions. The home, bosom of the now mandated nuclear family, was the target of the priest and the church he represented. In the 1883 pages of the Irish Ecclesiastical Record, the in-house journal of the clergy, they had read salutary treatises on the terrors of airborne disease. A series of articles entitled Sanitary Sermons warned that contagion floats in the air, it is stored in the earth, and may yet retain its vigor. It may be inhaled with the breath. It attacks man and the brute creation and spares neither palace nor cottage. New cottages were required, each, like the priest himself, described to be a beacon of civility, a model for emulation which should serve as a school of sanitation from which knowledge of the laws of health should spread in ever-widening circles, until cleanliness should take the place of squalor, and Ireland could no longer be pointed to as the enfant sale, as the term was. Again, the exemplary priest provided the model, for the promise of this modern domesticity shone forth from his own genteel arrangements. A cosy nest indeed, remarked Canon Sheehan's father Dan on entering his younger curate's abode, where the fire burnt merrily, cleanliness, neatness, tidiness, taste everywhere. The etchings and engravings gave tone to the walls. The piano lay open as if saying, "Come touch me." The books, he sighs, altogether a picture of delight. A bourgeois idyll, a rural Irish incarnation of the House Beautiful. It was a catalogue of middle-class orderliness and sensory delights. It could hardly be more unlike the rank Irish cabin of the congregation. Women were key to this transformation. The kitchen would become the space in which her new identity as housewife would be forged. The cloister, thought Father William Lockington, S.J., wherein she reigns as queen. Modest, retiring, homekeeping, kindly and gentle, the keeper of the Irish home, advised Guinan, could, like Mary, be the mistress of the Holy House. Under such direction, sociologist Tom Inglis confirms, women transformed the confined space in which they operated from what was, in reality, an animal house to a modern civilized home. And as those cabins made way for modern cottages, the primitive and uncleanly habits of the people that Father de Boy had decreed intolerable became indeed less tolerated. In their place were installed new internal and external practices ordained to be carried out with near religious devotion by the woman of the house, authorized by the Immaculate Queen of Heaven, by whose writ she cleaned the bodies and preserved the souls of her charges. If the Church's new domestic ideology had unveiled in the spotless mother the aspirational model of Irish womanhood, so the determinedly single male was frequently presented as its sinful countertype, to be shamed and ridiculed. The old bachelors of the parish, and their name was Legion, Guinan grumbles, were incorrigible. Missionary priests, the shock troops of the devotional revolution, whose purpose it was to heighten in a cumulative way the penitent's consciousness of sin, came to badger the old men in sermons. Again and again, writes Guinan, the preachers referred in scathing terms to the bachelors' miserable, forlorn condition, unsanitary houses, selfishness, cowardice, and spiritual destitution generally. Surrounded by their pigs and troubled by the putridity, they sought refuge in a reassuring past. Their literary incarnation is the same old grey fellow, comic villain of the poor mouth. A repository of ancient proverbs, shibboleths, and blarney masquerading as wisdom, the old fellow is, in Declan Kybert's phrase, the stage Gael, a Gaelically masked reiteration of the stage Irishman himself. A mockery of Irish manliness, this vainglorious layabout recognizes in the sweeping brush of the woman, mark of freedom for her, the instrument of his future subordination. In a desperate reassertion of patriarchal authority, he makes one final appeal to tradition. At the end of yet another day of boiling potatoes for Ambrose, and sweeping once more his detritus from her house, the old grey fellow charges the mother with un-Gaelicism. Untrue to her destiny, she had refused to bend, we're told, to the Cinnúint Gaelach, her traditional Gaelic fate. Bring it all back in, the woman. Bring it all back in, woman, the old fellow commands. And Bonaparte tells us she did so. She took a bucketful of muck, mud and ashes, and hen's droppings from the roadside, and spread it around the hearth gladly in front of me. When everything was arranged, I moved over near the fire, and for 5 hours I became a child in the ashes, a raw youngster, rising up according to the old Gaelic tradition. Later at midnight, he says, I was taken and put into bed, but the foul stench of the fireplace stayed with me for a week. It was a stale, putrid smell, and I do not think that the like will ever be there again. The like of that stench and the Irishness it had come to represent would indeed never be in the Irish cottage again. The desperate attempt by the old grey fellow to keep the pig in his parlour, to hold, that is, to a system of values antecedent to embourgeoisement, and to make of his native dirt a cordon sanitaire culturel that would keep modernity at bay, would come to naught. the woman of the house, had dared to sweep from the whitewashed cottage as the modern world was sweeping from Ireland the odours of a Gaelic past, once perceived as reassuring, now coded as offensive, even morally suspect. And if she and the new social order of modern hygiene she embodied had been thwarted by a model of Irish masculinity that clung anxiously to the remnants of a doomed past, it would not be for long. Despite the recalcitrance of the Irish peasant, now exposed by O'Brien as the obtuseness of the reactionary male, the new order of domesticity did come to reign over the cottages of Ireland. Though much was lost along this path to modernity, it was in large part a liberating dispensation, and it was enabled by an entente of Irish priest and Irish mother. Together they would transform hovels into homes and reconstruct the smellscape of Ireland. Thanks very much.
Joe, thank you so much for that wonderful excursion into the olfactory history of olfactory cultural history of modern Ireland. I'm sure it will have generated many questions. So we have a number of people in the room. Obviously, to ask a question, you just need to raise your hand. If you're joining us online, you should see a button on your screen that says reactions. Then you can raise a hand digitally once you press that button. So I welcome questions in both formats. Anybody want to start, Sean?
Hi.
Thanks so much. But one thing positively side here, you're presenting this drive for hygiene, the drive smell of the countryside as a work of the modernising force in our society, spearheaded by the Catholic Church. But when you look at the satirical writers in the 20th century and their presentation of the dominant Catholic ethos, they're not associated with burial hygiene, but associated with dirt. I mean, after all, Miles Oplin's book is a parody of the Gaelic coming of a saga, like there being a force or a place service. It's saying that basically the official culture romanticizes a really very squalid rural Ireland.
Absolutely.
The other two examples that occur to me are Mervyn Wall's Leaves to the Burning.
Lovely.
Where the middle class, arts graduate from Dublin is stuck in this ghastly provincial town where there isn't a single bath.
Yes.
And he's reduced to washing a third of himself every day.
Right.
This is the epitome of what it's like out in the streets. And the other one, of course, is Mervyn Wall's Unfortunate First.
Right. Where
the king of Cashel is discovered by an outraged abbot having a bath and is denounced for daring to sort of indulge in this sinful pagan habit of luxury. So for these satirical writers, the motif of what's now the dominant Catholic ethos is dirt, not hygiene.
Indeed, and I think you're absolutely right. Indeed, and I suppose indeed for most of us, if we go to another country, it's likely that we speak about the dirt itself rather than the smell. I mean, I think part of what you're saying is that these writers, weren't they aware of the smell? Did they think that the smell was not worth mentioning? I mean, we live most of our lives, I think, perhaps without being aware of the smells that are around us. Just quite where we blame the dirt or the smell that's off the dirt is a little bit difficult to say. I think my argument is attempting to say that until the people's notions of what was disgusting was actually altered, then the dirt itself was not going to be removed. That the process of removing the dirt required that their disgust be reshaped. And that's, I think, what's being done here. The smell is central to it as well, because I think underlying all this is the theory of miasma, the notion that was made very, very clear in the 19th century in England. That was that all smell was danger. In fact, that all smell was disease, was generally believed. And so that the smells themselves had to be removed from. That the people don't refer to the smells as such doesn't worry me so much, that they speak of the dirt, that they don't actually say that dirt smell. Was it quite simply understood that the smells emanated from them? We might as well say, indeed, it's coming back to the historians, wonderful people though they are, that apparently their history was deodorized themselves. It's not that they themselves weren't aware of smells, or that indeed that the histories, the people about whom they write, aren't actually aware of smells. But there is that curious lacuna, you might say. And I suppose all I'm attempting to do is in some sense to kind of rediscover them. But I absolutely take your point. Thanks. Yeah.
And of course, one of Father Brian's best known characters in The Hard Life is the German priest scholar
Father Fart, absolutely, indeed, absolutely, of course. And it is it's Sergeant Pluck, I think, if I remember, indeed, or McCrushkin, who tells us that smell is the human snout is not something that is ever actually capable, in fact, of understanding smells. I think scientists will agree to.
Good. Other questions? Okay, so I might ask one if we're waiting for other people to indicate that they want to ask something. So, I mean, if we were to offer perhaps a materialist critique of what you're proposing there, when you think about what happens in Irish agriculture over this long 19th century period, the number of pigs in Ireland collapses nearly catastrophically during the Great Famine as they're sold off or killed for food. The numbers never recover to the pre-famine levels. And one of the reasons for that is a transformation in the material kind of mode of the dominant mode of production in the Irish countryside, away from the kind of tillage, potato, pig, trifecta, which dominated in the first half of the 19th century, to accept on the Western seaboard the dominance of herds of cattle. So the Irish agricultural economy in the second half of the 19th century is increasingly one of herds of cattle that there are too many of them to keep in a house, even if such a habit wanted to be maintained. The pig in some ways over much of Ireland disappears as the dominant, agricultural beast. So you're tending to identify the priest as the dominant, mode of cultural transformation. I wonder, should we be looking at the peasant who becomes the middle class commercial farmer, who is the elder brother in many cases to the priest, as the kind of the dominant transformative kind of group in society, if we're looking for where cultural change is coming.
I think that's very likely, and of course, but your point there, indeed, that they're both coming from the same family, and that the priests themselves were obviously scions of the same middle class bourgeois rising population of Ireland. To become a priest was not an inexpensive business. They were invariably drawn from the middle classes, and the Maynooth was very clear that his job was the production of gentlemen who should be at least the equal of the Protestant minister in the parish. And that, going back to the relative collapse in numbers of pigs, I suppose I would say that makes it all the more extraordinary, indeed, in a way, that the perception of the Irish person's identification with the pig remained powerful, and indeed certainly in imagery, in fact, became even more powerful as the century continued. The population of pigs, I don't quite have here in the city, but in front of me, but I'm quite sure you're right. The population of pigs in Dublin, however, has been fairly well documented in a recent text, and it's really kind of extraordinary. In the 1870s, if I'm not mistaken, the figures went down from something like 200 per thousand down to something like 30 per thousand persons. So there was a huge number of pigs available in Dublin, even in the 1870s. And we find something like the sanitary sergeants, as they were called, trying to clean up Dublin. And they had quite a bit of success in cleaning up Dublin. And part of what I'm trying to say is that there was far less success in the cleaning up, actually, of Ireland itself. The success in Dublin was kind of amazing. And the figures are really extraordinary. Something like about 4,000 or 5,000 raids per month were taking place in Dublin on houses in order to remove the pigs from them, with great success, actually, finally. But I suppose that's what I go back to saying, is that epithet still managed to be attached to the Irishman is really kind of extraordinary. And I'm not even sure of its origins. I mentioned Gilray and those cartoons, but I think we could perhaps go back further. And I think that actually, of course, that short story of Peter, whatever, and his pig, the driving, my guess is that most English people came across for the first time and made the association between Irish people and pig, with the huge numbers of Irish pigs that were literally driven down to London. So they would get off at Bristol and by boat, and they would be driven, these vast quantities of pigs by Irish people, the whole way to London. I imagine that association was one of the first ones that would have made the notion of Paddy and the pig become essentially synonymous.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, it must be fascinating. I'm not going to head through smells as a result of it. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is you were talking about Snodgrass and White, and they do that history of the the pig. It seemed to me that you were presenting a very slanted view of their approach to it all, because the pig as emblem of disgust and potentially therefore consequence of shame is only part of their story. That they talk very much about the ambivalence of the pig.
Absolutely.
And particularly going back to the plays, how the pig could actually at times be substituted for what should have been the baby Christ. And the infant pig and infant human are rather too close to each other.
Absolutely.
I just wonder what.
No, I entirely agree. You're absolutely right. I mean, there simply wasn't room for that. But you're right. When I spoke about the liminality of the pig and the sort of dual identity and the ontological uncertainty of the pig, that's the kind of information that really drives that. You're totally right. I mean, the pig itself is not offensive to our view. If anything, it's perhaps the soft pinkness of the skin is far too like our own. The eyes that seem to be often imploring and deep. Eyes that Churchill understood very well. He says, when a pig looks you in the eye, he knows that he's looking at his equal. Pigs are indeed often very human. The number of images that we have, of course, of pigs as being the intelligent pig, the sapient pig, was a feature of carnivals and circuses throughout the 19th century. But long before, yeah.
The Irish cliche, the gentleman pays the rent.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Indeed, yes.
So what's worrying, which I think you're interested in this, is it actually accentuates the anxiety when policing that border between the proper and the improper,
You're certainly right.
for the human and the non-human. And we do at some point have to bring Darwin into
We absolutely do.
Discussions as the century moves on.
We absolutely do.
But so I wonder, in other words, if how many of those uses of pig as insult are in fact markers not of what we might think of as a kind of racism, markers instead of anxiety.
Yeah. There's an interesting moment actually in Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution. He, I think, he's generally accepted having coined the term the swinish multitude in that. And that phrase, the swinish multitude, becomes a resident rhetorical device that's used, of course, to speak of threats and this in the wake, obviously, of the beheading of a king. But there's a series of pamphlets that came out very shortly afterwards, indeed, in which the peasants themselves reappropriate that term and proclaim themselves quite proudly to be part of the swinish multitude, identify themselves as pigs. And so there was that way. So even that social contest in which the pig was actually used to define people unpleasantly, that they found that they could turn to their own advantage. That might be.
I mean, I'm sure you know,
of course,
the border.
Definitely.
Boy and pig butcher.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I'm just.
Yeah, no. The history of pigs in Ireland, I mean, is just absolutely fascinating, And if we want to go back into all Celtic myths, then we're going to find lots of pigs running around. Good. Thanks very much. I mean, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yes.
Things going on in my head crazily because we're now in the 21st century and things have changed dramatically. And this business of hygiene is like, God, no, it's not. And I'm a biologist, or well, I was. I'm not such a anyway. And normally, young little children, they have to develop an immune system. It doesn't just happen. And they get it from eating dirt. And you always see little kids taking, and we all did when we were kids. I've got a whole million. Anyway, that what's been happening now is hygiene, clean. All you see on the adverts is nothing but it's clean, and that's horrible, just infections. That's all I'm taking in. So that autoimmune diseases now are much more common.
Orban refers to a very common understanding, right?
The 50, 60 years ago, 70, I don't know, 100 years ago, we would probably kind of okay. It's totally not so incredibly one way or the other. And at the moment, it's going very closely towards the other, which is really scary.
Oban refers to what he describes as a series of myths in France at the time about smells, that smells were supposed to be disinfectants indeed. And the same so-called myths actually exist in Ireland. And there seems to be quite an amount of evidence, in fact, that means of the dung heaps, of doing with the disease, where that was practiced, that in fact disease rates were lower. I think Cardelay makes that point, that in fact it's not myth at all, that in fact there is a way in which these particular practices grew out of, that they had health giving benefits that the people recognized. Yeah, thanks very much.
We used to say this in the zoo and we think it looks gross, but a lot of the primates are, eating their snot. And what we should actually do, apparently,
There you are.
that's how we keep our own immune system going.
That's the only piece of useful advice that you're getting from this talk. All I thought was guff, but here you've actually got something that you can go home with and to turn to your advantage. Thank you very much. Good.
The toddlers are right.
Well,
That's great, right.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. So just a reminder to people who are joining us online, you can ask questions too. You just need to kind of raise your hand digitally, and I'll invite you to put a question. Yeah, Miles, sorry.
I just wonder about the evolution of this sort of stereotypical Irish into America as the particularly after during the famine, where the dirty Irish are associated the smells with disease, with typhus, with other diseases, and the need to move away from that. As time goes on,
Indeed, lots of references towards the middle and the end of the 19th century to the Irish as being pig-like, and indeed, direct identification of them with them as pigs. And I've wondered, in fact, if the term that's used about police so frequently is police being pigs, if that doesn't, and I'm even thinking of some cartoons, Simpsons, I think, I mean, the porcine face of the policeman in that. I wonder if that's not emerging from the profusion of Irish within the police forces of America at the time. Absolutely, there's loads of information that. I mean, you're totally right. Yes. Yeah, and how did the Irish escape finally from that? That's another day's work. But yes, they brought it to America with them, and it was perceived when they arrived in America. And I think that you'll find quite some cartoons at the time that will display just exactly that.
Okay, other questions? Yeah, Adam, I'm sorry. Robin.
So things should not be dirty, but delicious. So, at this period, Irish beer commanded a premium for markets towards the end of the 50s. I wonder, is there any carryover from this, the pig motif to advertising for bacon, or related to counteract that, or is food and the animal completely separate?
I don't know. It's outside of my range, I'm afraid. I don't know much about the marketing of these things, but you're quite right, in fact, that they are they're not particularly dirty animals, and they will go to some trouble in order to defecate to eat at a distance from the defecation. They don't want to be doing that. They're rolling in the mud. If unfortunately they're not given enough space, so that the rolling in the mud means rolling in their own shit, then that's unfortunate. They're doing that to cool down their very particularly tender pink skin, more than ourselves, indeed. But yes, how to, yeah, I'm sure there's some work on that. I mean, how do modern marketing sources, how do they overcome that identification? How did Irish people, I haven't dealt with anything like this in time, but how did ordinary people deal with the presence of the pig in their house, and then the pig that was killed afterwards, no more than any other animals? But one would imagine that the situation might be more acute because of that identification with the pig. And there's a series of reports, actually, and I'm thinking of one German or Danish person traveling around Ireland about the 1860s, and he's absolutely explicit that the Irish people, indeed, that they have that they've become essentially pigs. That's to say that he looks in the eyes of two of them, of the pig here and the gentleman beside him, and he says that they have become the same. He thinks it's because the Irish have been looking at some kind of weird Lamarckism perhaps going on, is that the peasant has looked into the pig's eyes so frequently that his eyes and the pig's eyes have become interchangeable.
There's a great anxiety by the late 19th century that Danish bacon is supplanting not only the previous Irish market for bacon in Britain, but it's also coming into the Irish market because this represents modernity and kind of advanced modes of agricultural production and marketing as well. So there's a lot of anxiety about bacon in Ireland at this time, especially the time.
But little anxiety about eating it, apparently. That's
So I was wondering, you think Joyce is kind of aware of this history when he has Leopold kind of lost after the pork kidney collection. What do you think? Just kind of I think there between kind of Jewish perspective, sort of diet and practices, and the Irish love.
It's kind of hilarious that Bloom, and he goes to a Jewish pork butcher's as well, of course, to buy that kidney in the first place. There's a whole different day's work to be spent, of course, actually thinking about Joyce and smells. I don't know of any novel that's as suffused with odor as Portrait of the Artist. And Joyce himself, speaking about Dubliners, he said that he'd like to hope that the smell of corruption the odor of corruption was arising from it. The Ulysses is full of magnificent smells. Indeed, I mean, one of my next projects, I hope, is going to be about smells in particular and the senses in Ulysses. I find it really fascinating. The very first page, we've got the smell of the rubber within the bed that the young Stephen memorizes. And of course, then there's Joyce himself and his own interest in smells. And I'm not going to start talking about his personal letters and that, but smell was a huge part of his life. I have a kind of suspicion, and I think that there might be something useful to be said about this, that there's been some work done on smells to suggest that sensitivity to particular smells can be evidence of a general sensitivity to more smells. People who are let's say olfactorily privileged, let's say, is that if they show sensitivity to one or two particular smells, that can be an indicator of them, and that refers somehow or other to some aberration in the DNA. Okay, I'm not making this at all clear, but I have a suspicion that there is some way in which were we able to check Joyce's DNA, and that can, of course, be done. There are relationships out there, that we might find that this slight aberration is there. And I'm thinking that because there's a very particular moment in Portrait of the Artist, you might remember, when Stephen, of course, wishing to subject himself to pain in all his senses, finds that the only one that he's not able to subject himself to is the sense of smell. And then he finds a way. And he finds, in fact, that it's the smell of male pheromones. In fact, the smell of dried male piss is what really offends his smells. And I think it's the case, and I'll find out more about this. I think it's the case, in fact, that sensitivity to that particular pheromone is something that, in fact, is indicative of a person having, as I say, a particularly acute sense of smell. So yeah, there's a lot to be said about Joyce and smell, and thanks for sending me down that path. I want to do it. Reading Ulysses, just for the smells alone, of course, starting off with Bloom there, of course, at the poor kidney, and at the end of that chapter, sitting down, and the pleasure that he gets from the smell that comes from his own defecation. Indeed, totally. That's.
You seem to have a mission to reodorize Ireland.
That's nicely put. Yeah, nicely put. Yes. Yeah. Right. He's going to re-Hellenize Ireland, says Mulligan, but maybe he's going to reodorize Ireland too. That's lovely. Lovely. Sorry.
We do hear more nowadays as well about synesthesia, this phenomenon of perceiving smells as coloured.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a group of people who have the most remarkable experiences from this, and I wonder if Joyce was one of those.
I wonder indeed. Yeah. By the way, actually, just talking about our sense of smell, it seems to be reasonably clear that we can train our sense of smell, and it's not very, very difficult. I mean, we go through most of our days, most of us, I think, actually, being only vaguely aware of these smells. And if we do anything that smells, just for the most part, in trying to avoid the ones that are unpleasant rather than going searching out the ones that are pleasant. You know that many of the cities in the world, there are people who lead odor trails so that you get to smell what's going along the way. But it's not difficult to train your sense of smell, and over the course of a couple of weeks, to refill your life with a whole dimension that may have been missing it's worth thinking about.
Honestly, I do wonder if perhaps our aversion to malodor is perhaps a little more hardwired than you've suggested, insofar as there are probably good evolutionary advantages to being averse to bad smells.
There surely are, though isn't it very peculiar that the seems, I understand, no particular distaste for children for wallowing in and eating their own feces. So even the most obvious ones aren't all that obvious. But yes, I take your point. Of course, it can't, presumably isn't entirely cultured. Surely we have to think that there's some smells out there that are designed in order to offend us. Yeah. There's a lot of work being done on these things, and most of this stuff is way above my competence level. The science of smell, certainly, as I said, Makrushkin was right, Flann was right, is that this is the human snout is not up to working out the intricacies of this.
Good. Do we have any other questions? Anybody online want to pose anything? Yeah, go ahead.
It's becoming like for all kids because of Peppa Pig.
Mm.
They adore.
Yeah.
It's all over. All the clothes.
As approved by Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
When in literature did the pig take on those more sinister connotations that Orwell talks about?
Well, when in literature, I wonder how far back we'd have to go actually to discover the pig as being a danger and cunning. And apparently the pig in Irish history, in popular folk culture, pigs were thought to be unlucky and essentially evil. Yeah. So it's there that it might appear in literature would hardly be surprising, presumably from the earliest days. But of course, it's the obvious example, indeed, and that's right. And Joyce is very aware of that. Right. And I'm not very familiar with my Bible, but aren't there pigs rolling down things? What's going on there? Guardian swine. Yeah.
This is a really off the topic of a question, but have you come across any evidence of pleasant smells in the Irish 19th century? Are there moments in that writing where someone says, "Oh, isn't that fun?"
Well, there was Thomas More, and I think that this was authentically, and if I were to look anywhere, I'd look for that romantic balladry of the time. Imagery would be the place to go. Of course, is that, I mean, for women especially, if their happy days are invariably surrounded by beautiful flowers. I mean, that sense of smell has to be read. And I think it's overlooked very frequently because it's there, but we haven't been looking for it. I mean, to look for smells in the imagery of the 19th century, indeed the 20th century, I think can be a very valuable pastime. Yeah. And burning turf, and the pleasant smell, the soft, gentle smell of burning turf, as distinct from that tang, what's the word, that acridity, I think, of coal. Yeah. And of course, when we talk about people visiting from that place, every time they visit, you bring with yourself a different perception of smells. So the very fact of arrival, no traveler ever arrived anywhere, but they became aware of smells to which they had become at home habituated. So I began by saying, of course, that every nation knows that other nations smell, whereas we don't, is a fact, of course.
Good. Okay. I think maybe we'll finish there for this afternoon. Just before we finish, just a reminder that we have an extra seminar this week, a rescheduled one. We have Shona Hill on Wednesday at 4:30 talking about Irish women playwrights in the Irish Free State period. So that will be both in person in this room at 4:30 on Wednesday and online. And then next Monday, we have Robin at the back. We'll be launching Robin's book, The Shadow of a Taxman. Who funded the Irish Revolution? So that'll be in this room at 4:30 next Monday, and you're all very welcome, and also online. You're all very welcome to join us then. So thank you all for coming. We finish by thanking Joe for sharing his research, fascinating research on the olfactory cultural history of Ireland with us this afternoon. So,
thanks for listening to me. Thanks very much. That's all right.